Everyone knew where Lucky Luciano sat. Same restaurant, same table, same chair. It wasn't arrogance, it was control. From that seat, Lucky could see the door, the room, the waiters, the faces that belonged there and the ones that didn't. It was a position earned over years, a silent signal to everyone watching that nothing in that space moved without his awareness. And that's exactly why it became a target. The men who wanted Lucky dead didn't chase him through the streets. They didn't send gunmen into the open. They didn't try to outdraw his bodyguards or outfight his reputation. They waited. They studied. They noticed the same thing everyone else had noticed for years. Lucky Luciano didn't change seats. In the underworld, habits are invitations. Predictability is permission. And when someone finally decided Lucky had become impossible to remove any other way, the solution wasn't clever. It was inevitable. They put a bomb where Lucky always sat. Not near him, not close enough to wound. Exactly where his body was supposed to be. It was timed for routine, not surprise. Timed for certainty, not chaos. The kind of plan you only make when you're convinced the target won't deviate by even a few inches. On that day, the restaurant looked the same. The air felt the same. The faces were familiar. Lucky walked in like he always did, and for a brief moment everything unfolded exactly as planned. Then something changed. Not dramatically, not loudly, no one shouted, no one ran. Lucky stopped, just long enough to hesitate, just long enough to look again, just long enough to choose a different seat. No one in the room understood why, but somewhere else someone did. Because if Lucky had sat down where he always sat, this wouldn't be a story about survival. It would be a footnote, a closed chapter, a chair blown apart in a flash of fire and certainty. Instead, it became another reminder of why Lucky Luciano outlived men who tried to kill him with force, numbers, and explosives. Not because he was untouchable, but because he never trusted what felt too familiar. For Lucky Luciano, that chair wasn't comfort, it was command. He chose it years earlier for practical reasons. Line of sight to the door, clear angles across the room, waiters approaching from predictable paths. From there, Lucky could read posture, hesitation, familiarity. He didn't need body language explained to him. He felt it. Over time, the seat became something else, a signal. When Lucky sat there, everyone in the room adjusted. Conversations lowered. Strangers measured themselves. Allies knew where to stand. Enemies knew where not to look. The chair told the room who controlled it before Lucky said a word. That's the danger of consistency. In the underworld, habits aren't neutral. They're data. Men who wanted Lucky gone didn't need insiders or confessions. They didn't need schedules or phone taps. All they needed was patience and a notebook. The pattern was perfect. Same restaurant, same time window, same table, same chair. Week after week, year after year. Predictability removes risk for the attacker. A gun requires proximity. A knife requires timing. A bomb only requires certainty. And Lucky's seat provided that certainty. There was another reason the chair mattered. Lucky believed routine discouraged chaos. Familiarity made people comfortable. Comfortable people made mistakes. In his mind, changing seats suggested fear, and fear invited testing. Sitting in the same place projected stability. Stability projected control. It worked for years, until control turned into assumption. The men planning the attack understood something fundamental. You don't kill a figure like Lucky by challenging his power head-on. You kill him by exploiting the infrastructure of his confidence, the systems he trusted, the habits he defended. They didn't target Lucky. They targeted his routine. That's why the plan wasn't rushed. No dramatic countdown, no volatile timing. The bomb wasn't meant to surprise him. It was meant to wait for him, to sit where he always sat, at the exact moment he always arrived. A perfect crime depends on the target doing what he's always done, and everyone believed Lucky would. After all, he'd survived gunmen, wars, betrayals, prison, exile. Why would a chair be the thing that changed him? That question is exactly what the planners relied on. Because when a man lives long enough, he starts believing the things that haven't killed him won't. He trusts the familiar more than the unknown. And in a business built on violence, familiarity can feel like safety. But safety, in that world, is often the most dangerous illusion of all. By the time the bomb was placed, the decision had already been made. Not just to kill Lucky, but to kill him in a way that left no doubt. No chase, no witnesses, no second chances. Just one chair, waiting patiently for the man who had always trusted it. A gun would have been simpler. A knife would have been quieter. But neither would have worked. Anyone who had ever tried to get close to Lucky Luciano learned the same lesson fast. Proximity was a privilege, and privileges were monitored. Faces were remembered. Patterns were logged. Even men Lucky trusted were never fully unsupervised when it mattered. So the planners ruled out the obvious methods first. A shooting meant witnesses. Panic. Retaliation. Too many variables. A stabbing meant proximity, timing, and escape. All unreliable. Poison required trust, patience, and repeated access. Dangerous and slow. What they needed was distance and certainty. A bomb solved both. It didn't need courage. It didn't need loyalty. It didn't need a clean getaway. It just needed Lucky to do what he always did. Using an explosive wasn't about brutality. It was about finality. In the underworld, bombs were statements reserved for moments when subtlety had failed. They said one thing clearly: this problem ends today. There was another reason the decision mattered. No single family wanted responsibility. A bomb didn't point back to a shooter. It pointed nowhere. No fingerprints that mattered. No trigger man to flip. If Lucky died, the story would be simple. An unknown attack by unknown enemies, probably tied to old grudges or foreign rivals. Everyone could deny, everyone could mourn, everyone could move on. That's why the plan never needed a meeting. It didn't need approval. It didn't need consensus. It only needed silence. Once the idea surfaced, it spread the way dangerous ideas always do, without attribution. One man suggested explosives weren't off the table. Another agreed guns were too risky. A third mentioned the seat, the routine, the certainty. No one said, do it. No one had to. By the time the bomb was being prepared, the decision already felt inevitable. The timing wasn't rushed. It didn't need to be. The power of routine is that it creates patience. When you know where someone will be, waiting becomes strategy instead of delay. They weren't hunting Lucky. They were waiting for him. That's what made the plan so dangerous. It didn't rely on luck, speed, or nerve. It relied on habit. The one thing even the smartest men forget to question after surviving long enough. And as the device was placed, hidden exactly where Lucky's body was expected to be, the planners believed they'd solved the last remaining problem. They couldn't outfight Lucky. They couldn't outmaneuver him. So they let his own certainty do the work. All that remained was for him to sit down. And history, up to that moment, suggested he would. The device wasn't rushed. That was the detail that made it lethal. Whoever built it didn't want spectacle. They wanted inevitability. The timing wasn't designed around noise or chaos. It was designed around habit. A narrow window, calibrated to the minute Lucky usually arrived, sat, ordered, and settled in. Not early, not late. Right on routine. The placement was just as deliberate. Not somewhere dramatic. Not near an exit. Not in a spot that invited suspicion. It was hidden where familiarity did the camouflage. Where no one questioned the presence of a chair, a table, a floor panel that had always been there. The kind of place the staff cleaned around without thinking. The kind of place Lucky never inspected because it had never betrayed him before. That was the brilliance of it. Bombs fail when they rely on chaos. This one relied on normalcy. The men behind it knew Lucky's habits better than his enemies ever had. They knew the order of his movements. They knew the pause before he sat. They knew which way he turned his body, how he angled the chair, how long he lingered before speaking. Those details came from watching, not from courage. And watching leaves no witnesses. By the time the device was in place, there was nothing left to decide. No backup plan, no secondary target, no if this doesn't work. That kind of planning only introduces doubt. The confidence of the operation came from believing there were no variables left, except one. What they couldn't account for was not a guard, or a sweep, or a tip-off. They couldn't account for the fact that Lucky Luciano had survived long enough to distrust perfection. On that day, the room looked right. The people looked right. The air felt right. That was exactly the problem. The longer Lucky stood there, the more the plan leaned on a single assumption. That a man who had always trusted his seat would trust it one more time. Because that's how routines end. Not with suspicion, but with complacency. The bomb didn't tick. It didn't hum. It didn't announce itself. It waited, as patiently as the men who planted it. In that moment, time wasn't measured in seconds. It was measured in habits colliding with instinct. And as Lucky approached the table, the plan reached its final phase. The part where nothing mattered anymore except one movement. Sit, that was all it required. Sit, and everything ends. What the planners never understood was that certainty cuts both ways. When everything lines up too perfectly, a man who has lived through chaos begins to wonder why. And that question, asked in a fraction of a second, was the only crack the bomb couldn't seal. The room didn't react when Lucky Luciano walked in. That was normal. Heads didn't turn too fast. Voices didn't drop too sharply. The staff moved the way they always did. Familiar faces, familiar noise, familiar rhythm. On the surface, it was another ordinary moment. The kind that had happened hundreds of times before. Lucky moved toward the table without hesitation. The chair was there, exactly where it always was. From the outside, nothing was wrong. And that was precisely the danger. The most successful hits don't announce themselves. They hide inside routine, inside comfort, inside the confidence that comes from believing you've seen every trick before. Lucky reached the table and did what he had done 1,000 times. He stopped. Not abruptly, not dramatically. Just a fraction of a second longer than usual. To anyone watching, it looked like nothing. A pause to straighten a jacket, to glance around the room, to acknowledge someone across the way. No one stiffened. No one reacted. No one sensed what was happening in his head. But Lucky wasn't looking at people. He was reading the room itself. Something was too clean, too aligned, too perfect. The kind of perfection that doesn't exist naturally in places filled with flawed men, rushed staff, and constant movement. A detail was missing. Or rather, something was present that shouldn't have been. He didn't analyze it. He didn't try to name it. That kind of thinking takes too long. Instead, Lucky did the one thing that broke the entire plan. He pulled the chair back, then slid it aside, and sat somewhere else. No explanation, no comment, no warning. A different seat, same table, barely a few feet away. To the room, it meant nothing. People shifted their attention back to their drinks, their conversations, their food. To anyone who wasn't watching closely, the moment disappeared as quickly as it came. But somewhere else, someone felt it immediately, because the plan had no margin for error. It wasn't designed for almost. It wasn't designed for close enough. It was designed for exactness. And in that instant, exactness was gone. Lucky leaned back in the new chair, casual, relaxed, as if the decision had been random. As if he hadn't just stepped away from the place where his body was supposed to be. No alarms sounded, no explosions followed. Just the unbearable realization spreading outward from one mind to another that the opportunity had passed. The most dangerous second of the entire operation had come and gone, not with violence, but with a choice so small no one could justify acting on it. And the men who had trusted certainty learned the cruelest lesson of all. When a plan depends on habit, all it takes is one moment of doubt to destroy it. It wasn't luck. That's the part people get wrong. Lucky Luciano didn't move because of fear, superstition, or instinct alone. He moved because something violated a rule he'd learned the hard way. Danger hides inside things that stop behaving normally. The chair wasn't wrong. The room was. Lucky had spent his life reading environments, not people. Faces could lie. Loyalty could shift. But rooms had patterns, and patterns were honest until they weren't. What triggered the pause wasn't a single obvious detail. It was a mismatch. The table was set the same way, the staff behaved the same way. The timing was perfect. Too perfect. In places like that, perfection meant preparation. Restaurants were messy by nature. Chairs were slightly crooked. Floors creaked. Something was always off. But that day, the space around his usual seat felt managed, subtly adjusted in a way no one would notice unless they had watched the same spot for years. Lucky didn't identify the threat. He identified the anomaly. And that's the distinction that saved him. Men who survive long enough don't ask, "What's the danger?" They ask, "Why does this feel arranged?" Lucky had been targeted before. Gunmen, knives, betrayals, all loud, all emotional. This wasn't that. This felt quiet, patient, detached. The kind of danger that doesn't rush because it doesn't need to. So he changed the only variable still under his control: his position. By sitting somewhere else, Lucky didn't escape the bomb by inches. He invalidated the entire design. Explosives don't adapt. They don't improvise. They wait for precision. And once precision disappears, the plan dies with it. Nothing happened because nothing could happen anymore. Later, the device would be found, or removed, or neutralized quietly. The details never mattered, because the outcome was already sealed in that single decision. From that day on, Lucky never sat the same way twice. Not in restaurants, not in meetings, not anywhere that could be studied. He understood what the bomb had really been. Not an attempt on his life, but a test. A test of whether habit had finally beaten awareness. It hadn't, and that failure sent a message just as clear as any explosion ever could. Lucky Luciano wasn't invincible. He was something far more dangerous, unpredictable. From that moment forward, anyone thinking about trying again understood the problem they now faced. You couldn't plan around Lucky anymore. You couldn't wait for routine. You couldn't rely on repetition. Because the chair that was supposed to kill him taught him the final rule of survival. The moment something feels too familiar is the moment you move. Lucky Luciano never talked about the chair. He didn't tell people why he moved. He didn't explain what he noticed. He didn't turn the moment into a warning story. Because explanations create patterns, and patterns are what nearly killed him. From that day on, the routine vanished. No fixed seats, no predictable entrances, no habits anyone could map with confidence. Lucky didn't become paranoid. He became fluid, and fluidity in that world was survival. The men who planted the bomb learned something far more unsettling than failure. They learned that even perfect planning collapses when the target refuses to behave like a target. You can study a man for years, track his movements, time his habits to the minute, and still lose everything to a pause that lasts less than a second. That's the danger of relying on certainty. Guns can miss, bombs can fail, but habits betray you quietly. Lucky didn't survive because he was fearless. He survived because he questioned what felt normal. And in the underworld, that's the difference between men who die as routines and men who live long enough to change the rules. The chair was supposed to end his story. Instead, it ended his habits. And once Lucky Luciano stopped being predictable, killing him stopped being simple.